Hello, everyone, and welcome to the California Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Jen Fields. I'm the facilitator of the Coastal Resilience Network, as well as the Climate Ready Sea Grant State Fellow for the State Coastal Conservancy. The California Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. We will provide a link to the network if you would like to join or watch past webinars, including today's, on our website. These links can be found on the registration email and in follow-up emails. Today's presentation will be on critical infrastructure at risk, sea level rise planning guidance for the California coastal zone. The California Coastal Commission staff released a public review draft of their new planning guidance document this past August. With a focus on water and transportation infrastructure, the goal of the draft guidance is to promote resilience coastal infrastructure and protection of coastal resources by providing local governments, asset managers, and other stakeholders with policy and planning information to help inform sea level rise adaptation decisions that are consistent with the Coastal Act. As a reminder, public comment is still being accepted on this guidance, and links will be shared throughout the webinar for you to send the comments to. They will be closing on this Friday, September 24th. Today, we welcome two panelists from the California Coastal Commission to give the presentation, Matella and Hanna Payne. Matella is an environmental scientist with the California Coastal Commission Statewide Planning Unit. She completed her PhD in environmental science, policy, and management at UC Berkeley with a focus on climate change and ecosystem restoration. Her work at the Coastal Commission furthers implementation of the agency's sea level rise policy guidance, part of a larger statewide strategy to respond to climate change. Hanna Payne is the 2021 California State Sea Grant Fellow at the Coastal Commission. She graduated with a master's degree in environmental communication from Stanford University in 2020 and worked at Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions on climate change and fisheries policy research prior to joining the commission as a fellow. At the Coastal Commission, she works with the statewide planning unit on issues related to sea level rise and with the mapping unit on a database for coastal armoring structures. In addition, Madeline Cavalieri with the statewide planning manager for the Coastal Commission will be available on the webinar during the Q&A sessions. To go briefly into webinar logistics, we will listen and watch their presentation for about 15 minutes, followed up with a Q&A session until 1:45. During their presentation, I will be sharing links via the chat function on the bottom left-hand side of your Zoom screen. If you would like to submit questions during their presentation, please do so by using the Q&A box at the bottom right-hand side of the Zoom screen. Please do not use the chat for the Q&A session. I will collect, review, and read the questions, and the Coastal Commission team will respond. And this webinar will be recorded and available for review after the webinar. And with that, I will happily pass the virtual mic off to Mary.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Matella again, and I'm an environmental scientist with the Coastal Commission Statewide Planning Unit. I'm going to be presenting today with the Commission's Sea Grant Fellow, Hanna Payne. And of course, our statewide planning manager, Madeline Cavalieri, will also be here to help answer any questions after we're done presenting. So first off, we'd like to thank you for this opportunity to introduce the Commission's new draft guidance document, Critical Infrastructure at Risk, Sea Level Rise Planning Guidance for California's Coastal Zone. The guidance was released on August 16th, and it's now available for review and comment. So this document is a product of a recent NOAA federal grant project of special merit. It's intended to develop innovative projects to improve coastal management programs and address national priorities. So the guidance promotes resilient infrastructure and protection of resources, coastal resources, by providing local governments, asset managers, and other stakeholders with sea level rise planning and policy information. It also builds on and complements the Commission's sea level rise policy guidance that was just last updated in 2018. It supports the achievement of numerous strategic plan action items, objectives, and goals. So next slide, Hanna. So as part of today's introduction, I'll discuss some of the early outreach and coordination that went into development of the guidance, and Hanna will then review the purpose and scope of the guidance, give you a description of the document itself, including some of its key messages. Next slide. So early on in the project, we released a survey to gather input from local governments and interested parties as we developed the scope for the content of the guidance. Specifically, we sought to understand local priorities in terms of vulnerabilities of infrastructure to sea level rise and what type of information would be most useful to stakeholders for sea level rise planning. The project development was also guided by a steering committee of internal staff members at the Coastal Commission, including staff with legal, enforcement, engineering, ecology, and district expertise, as well as the sea level rise team. So this group was instrumental in determining the statewide priorities for us from a commission perspective, and it was important to help shape the Coastal Act policy analysis and model policy language. Next slide. So survey results altogether, we received 90 responses to our survey, and about half of the responses noted that roads in their communities are vulnerable now to coastal hazards, and about a third said the same of stormwater and wastewater, that type of infrastructure. So both wastewater infrastructure and roads are highlighted as priorities to be addressed in the infrastructure guidance by more than half the respondents. So the top 3 most commonly cited topics for what type of information would be most useful for sea level rise planning are here on this slide. More information on developing and implementing phased adaptation approaches, more information on adaptation strategies in general, including the pros and cons of different strategies, and people requested guidance on using natural infrastructure in their adaptation strategies. So in response to the survey results and other stakeholder feedback, we chose to focus on transportation and water infrastructure, including highways, local roads, railroads, wastewater, stormwater, and water supply assets, really with a focus on groundwater supply. This focus is also reflective of the types of projects the Commission most commonly sees. Although the guidance doesn't discuss other infrastructure types directly, we believe that the information and the recommendations could translate to other assets that share similar characteristics, which we'll touch on in a little bit. Next slide. So since this document focuses on transportation and water infrastructure, Caltrans and the state and regional water resources control boards were important key partners in developing these respective guidance topics. A larger group of state agencies, including those listed on this slide here, as well as local government partners, including the Commission's local government working group, reviewed or offered comments on early iterations of our draft guidance. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Hanna to walk you through the guidance document. Thanks, Hanna.
No problem. Thank you so much, Mary. So the overall goal of the guidance is to promote resilient coastal infrastructure and protection of coastal resources by providing policy and planning information to help inform sea level rise adaptation decisions that are consistent with the Coastal Act. As with other sea level rise guidance the Commission has provided, this draft guidance provides interpretive guidelines rather than new regulations. And it should be read as policy options and topics to consider rather than a checklist of items that must be addressed. It should also be noted that not everything in this guidance will apply to all users. The document provides a starting point and example policy language that can be modified, but does not negate the need for coordination with Commission staff and other stakeholders. So the document itself is split up into 6 chapters with sections on sea level rise, planning, background information, key challenges and opportunities for adaptation planning for critical infrastructure in particular, and more detailed information on transportation and water infrastructure. The guidance also contains appendices with more information on key topics such as nature-based adaptation, case studies, and notably a section with example policy language that can be integrated into new or updated LCPs. So going into a little bit more detail, Chapter 3 describes the unique challenges of sea level rise planning for critical infrastructure. And although the process is similar in that it includes assessing vulnerabilities and identifying adaptation options, there are 2 main facets of critical infrastructure. First, its purpose and role in our communities. And second, the physical characteristics of these assets. that add complexity to adaptation planning and make it substantively different than planning for residential, commercial, or other types of development. As described in this chapter, critical infrastructure provides benefits for the public at large, serving a variety of necessary and practical functions in communities, the loss of which would have potentially damaging social, economic, political, and public health consequences. Further, critical infrastructure is typically much larger than other types of development, including components that extend over large areas and cross multiple jurisdictional boundaries, and is often comprised of interconnected systems in which vulnerabilities could result in cascading impacts. So, taken all together, these factors magnify the consequences of inaction, while at the same time increasing the scale, complexity, time, and costs associated with adaptation. Chapter 4 discusses 5 key topics that should be considered to address the unique challenges of planning for critical infrastructure and to successfully develop practical and implementable solutions on a local and regional scale that ensure equity among coastal users. These include coordinated planning, including by working with nearby jurisdictions and regional climate collaboratives and aligning planning documents and other frameworks such as joint powers authorities and special districts. Second, addressing environmental justice concerns through dedicated outreach and engagement, and by completing alternatives analyses that consider the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. Third, by developing phased adaptation approaches, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. Fourth, evaluating the full life cycle costs and benefits of different adaptation strategies, and prioritizing funding for strategies that help to avoid hazardous areas. And fifth, identifying opportunities to expand the use of nature-based adaptation strategies. Each of these topics is described more thoroughly in chapter 4, and each includes its own set of recommendations. But in the interest of time, I won't run through all of them. I do want to touch on one example though. So these on this slide are the recommendations associated with phased adaptation, which involves developing and implementing strategies that maintain essential functions while providing time for planning a long-term approach. These recommendations include consideration of the long-term scenarios of sea level rise planning, defining the time periods over which specific strategies will work, and implementing strategies through LCP policies that are updated at appropriate intervals. The guidance also encourages phased adaptation to address the need to prioritize the most vulnerable infrastructure while considering the necessity for network systems to work together, which is key for ensuring the resilience of critical infrastructure over time. So chapters 5 and 6 discuss transportation and water infrastructure respectively, specifically touching on highways, rail, wastewater, stormwater, and water supply infrastructure with the focus on groundwater, like Mary mentioned. Each chapter includes a brief discussion of statewide vulnerabilities, the relevant regulatory and governance frameworks, and some more specific adaptation considerations for each type of critical infrastructure. In addition to the main body of the document, the guidance includes a number of appendices that provide additional information on topics like relevant Coastal Act policies, sea level rise planning, statewide infrastructure vulnerabilities, examples of critical infrastructure adaptation projects that have already been undertaken, nature-based adaptation strategies, the cost savings associated with proactive adaptation, and transportation planning. So most notably, Appendix B includes example policy language that can be used when developing new or updated LCPs to help implement the recommendations in the critical infrastructure guidance. The model policies are split up between transportation policies and water infrastructure policies, and cover common topics like planning processes, best available science and appropriate hazards analyses, siting and design of new infrastructure, and implementing specific adaptation strategies. This example language also covers specific topic areas like environmental justice, scenic highway 1, and groundwater change. I do want to reiterate here that the model policies are offered as a tool that local governments may choose to use as a starting point from which to make edits or otherwise develop policies that are appropriate for local conditions and priorities. They're not a checklist of items that the Coastal Commission would expect to see in an LCP. The model policies could be rewritten in any number of ways to account for specific goals or implement other initiatives, provided that they are still consistent with the Coastal Act. Appendix E consists of 5 case studies that provide examples of successful adaptation of critical infrastructure in the coastal zone. For example, the relocation of the Morrow Bay wastewater treatment plant approved in 2019 reflects a managed retreat adaptation method that incorporates a long-term plan for protecting wastewater and recycled water capabilities. This approved project addresses a number of concerns associated with the original facility and original project proposal, including coastal hazards, land use priorities, and potential impacts on coastal resources. A significant number of planning partners were involved in the development of this outcome. Collaborators included city and county staff, state government agencies, and tribal representatives. Another case study example in Appendix E highlights the Highway 1 roadway realignment in San Luis Obispo County. This approved project took 20 years of study, planning, coordination, and construction to ensure that the final inland relocation addressed the input gathered from a wide variety of stakeholders, including state agencies, private sector landowners, and the public. This managed retreat project not only protected vulnerable transportation infrastructure from coastal hazards, but also provided and enhanced public access opportunities, maintained visual resources west of the new highway location, and supported the restoration of coastal wetlands through mitigation activities. So as Mary mentioned earlier, the draft is now out for public review. A link to the document can be found in the highlights section on the homepage of the Commission's website. We're requesting that all comments be returned by September 24th. Thank you so much for your time, and we are now happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah and Mary. I am just going to pop the guidance website and that email link in the chat for everyone to use. And then again, use the Q&A function on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. We do not have any questions as of yet, but please add any questions that you have about the document. Okay, now we got one. There are multiple questions with this, so I'll just kind of ask them one by one. This is from Daniel. What is the specific definition for critical infrastructure? Does it extend to infrastructure that serves private development, such as a septic system that is for a single-use family dwelling? The Coastal Commission staff has recently suggested that the definition is inclusive of these private and relatively minor infrastructure.
Sorry, it's taken. Did you want me to go ahead, Jen?
Yes, that'd be great.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, and I might ask Mary to help me as well with this. We do have some discussion in the document about how to appropriately define critical infrastructure, but I think, in terms of septic systems, I think, the idea is that when we have necessary services to provide either residential or commercial development, that they should be addressed in a way to ensure that they can be maintained and protected over a period of time. At the same time, this document is focusing more on kind of public large scale infrastructure. And so I think that, as with anything, we're going to have to look at the context of any situation. This document is providing guidance. It's not regulations. It's not, defining what you need to do in any one situation. It's trying to provide kind of that overarching guidance. So Mary, I don't know if you wanted to add anything about specifically how we defined or discussed defining critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, we did talk about this a little bit, and I was just kind of paging through the document to look even more, but really, I think when we start talking about what are the characteristics of critical infrastructure, that kind of helps you understand the perspective that we're coming from. There are a lot of definitions out there from different federal agencies, and the state of California has their own definition. And we don't really try to get too specific or hung up on the definition of critical infrastructure. We really just try to explain in general what we're looking at in terms of water, the water and the transportation types. So I think that some of this also, is important because there is the word critical infrastructure in some LCP policies. So people are like, well, what do you mean by critical? Because that might be tied to a particular way of looking at a sea level rise scenario. for example? So are you looking at a higher, H++ scenario for sea level rise, that kind of thing? But so kind of like Madeline said, I think we kind of would look at it on a case by case basis about saying something was critical infrastructure, in that way. But does that help a little bit, Madeline, you think? But the characteristics of what we really are looking at, what kind of projects we're trying to address with the policies that are in that Appendix B is in the document.
Awesome. Thank you very much for covering that question. And since this guidance document is guidance, how does the Coastal Commission staff expect the guidelines to be used since they aren't adopted into law? Are they more advisory? Madeline, could you speak to that first?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said, this is guidelines, guidance. It's not regulation. We do have a specific section in the Coastal Act that allows the Commission to adopt guidance as interpretive guidance for the use of developing LCP updates. And so our staff recommendation is to bring this forward to the Commission for that adoption. But again, that's not a regulation, that is a guidance. And these aren't written in a way that they can be specific to any one place or situation or jurisdiction. They're meant to provide, explanations and information and potential language that could be used. It's really meant to be a tool, because we know that addressing, critical infrastructure adaptation to sea level rise is going to be really a monumental undertaking in the state.
Great, thank you. And I apologize, I actually don't know what SB1 is. So if SB1 is passed, how would these guidelines be used in relation to the guidelines that SB1 requires? So if you just want to briefly explain what SB1 is and then go into how that relates to your guidance, that'd be great.
I actually, unfortunately, am not able to. I have looked at SB1 and tracked it through the process, but I wouldn't be able to summarize and explain exactly how this guidance would be used. Certainly, this guidance is meant to be aligned with state efforts related to sea level rise, and so certainly my hope would be that this can work together in concert with the requirements of SB1, but we would have to analyze that in more detail to be able to really answer that question. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thanks for covering that a little bit. And then there's another comment for you all to look in at the chat of kind of the presentation. Another consideration to look at is identifying situations when the shoreline protection will be allowed, such as protecting existing critical infrastructure. But I think that's more just a comment, not a question directed. And then
I think I could quickly speak to that. I mean, I think what we tried to be clear on in this guidance is that it's super important to take a phased approach. And I think that we acknowledge that in some cases, shoreline armoring may be needed to protect critical infrastructure, but it also needs to be, and always needs to be, in the context of looking at long-term planning. That's what's unique about critical infrastructure, is that it has a different value to the public and society, and there are different impacts associated with infrastructure failing. And so, yeah, I think we do call that out as something that may, and the Commission has indeed approved shoreline armoring for critical infrastructure in some cases, when it's part of a phased approach, when that long-term planning process is going on, and when it's determined to be necessary to best protect coastal resources, including by kind of looking at nature-based strategies that might be working together with shoreline protection.
Awesome, thank you for covering that. And then another question in the chat is there a reason that why desalination facilities are not included in this guidance?
We wanted to focus on the topics that were coming up most often in LCP updates, because it is guidance for LCPs. Like Mary described, we did some survey outreach to try and get at that. We do understand that desalination is an important issue, and it's something that will need to be covered at some point. But in order to kind of keep a manageable scope, we have focused on these two areas to start.
Mary, do you have anything else to add, or is that good?
Oh yeah, no, I absolutely agree. There was just, we had to limit the scope to get where we got, and that would have been a little bit too much for the time frame and the funding that we had for this project.
Thank you. And then another question from Jeremy in the chat. Many nature-based strategies for sea level rise adaptation will result in wetland fill and direct conflict with section 30233. Is the Coastal Commission considering amending this section to accommodate the needs of nature-based strategies? Thank you for the presentation.
So Coastal Commission staff doesn't think that the Coastal Act needs to be amended in order to provide for nature-based strategies. We are working on some additional guidance to help explain that. But I think kind of the overarching perspective of Coastal Commission staff at this point is that, you know, sea level rise and climate change are going to fundamentally change our shorelines. And so really for the first time, we're not for the first time. Of course, we've always known that the shoreline is dynamic, but I think that we really understand that the dynamic nature of the shoreline needs to be considered when we're thinking about things like restoration, nature-based strategies. And so, you know, the specifics of fill and when fill can be allowed, I think our analysis thus far has shown that we think that nature-based adaptation strategies can be carried out in the coastal zone under the current statutes in a way that protects resources and, you know, really facilitates and encourages those strategies. And we do hope to be providing additional guidance on that soon, or at least some informational memos and things like that. But again, not within the scope of this particular effort.
Thank you very much for covering that. I'm looking forward to further guidance on that as well. And then I'm sure this is a question I also would love to know. Do you anticipate that grant funding to be made available for adaptation planning and projects through the infrastructure bill?
Again, I'm not good on the latest bills, but I can tell you that the Coastal Commission is going to be adjusting our LCP grant criteria. We're going to be bringing that forward at our October hearing for an additional $30 million. I believe at least 20 million will be passed through to local governments and can also be passed through local governments to other entities in order to do adaptation planning work. So that will be announced in the next couple of days. And then the commission will be hearing that in October. And we're hoping grant application announcements will go out soon thereafter, like hopefully by November.
Thank you. And then another question in the chat. And again, if you could please use the Q&A function, it's a little easier for me to track it there. So I can click that it's answered, but I can also read the chat as well. So there's a focus on critical infrastructure with the ACE++ scenario. And there isn't currently debate on the sea level rise productions or whether or not they should be used for planning.
I think I understand the gist of the question. So and just to say, you know, the commission, so in 2018, the Ocean Protection Council adopted guidance that included the H++ scenarios as the most recent best available science projections and recommended using the using the H++ scenario for critical infrastructure planning, not for design, but for planning, understanding what that worst case scenario would be so that we're not caught flat-footed in 50 years with a whole bunch of infrastructure that's vulnerable. The commission then in 2018 updated our main sea level rise guidance document to reflect those OPC recommendations, calling for looking, again, evaluating, not designing for, but evaluating the worst case scenario for critical infrastructure and evaluating the medium high scenario for residential development. This guidance document relies on that, but doesn't make any changes. So those have been in place since 2018. The commission has been using them, using the guidance, the projections, and I think more and more tools are becoming available to make that an easier thing to do in the planning process. But again, it's not that the commission is requiring, new bridges and highways to be 10 feet up in the air. It's just wanting to analyze what would happen to new projects if the worst case scenario would come to be, and then how do we want to plan for that? How many decades do we need in order to start planning ahead? That kind of thing, making sure we're making wise investments now.
Can I chime in on that question too? I just want to let folks know that the chapter 2 of the guidance has a couple of inset boxes. One describes planning for the H++ sea level rise scenario. So it kind of gives some of what Madeline's talking about and some examples of how it's been done in the past. And then there's a box number 2, which is tools that you can use to analyze the H++ sea level rise scenario. So it kind of gives a couple of links for people who might be looking for resources to do that. And just the relevance or why we're even bringing it up is from the state of California sea level rise guidance, the OPC 2018 document Madeline was talking about. And we quote it here just to reiterate for folks. For high consequence projects with a design life beyond 2050 that have little to no adaptive capacity would be irreversibly destroyed or significantly costly to relocate or repair, or would have considerable public health, public safety, or environmental impacts should this level of sea level rise occur. The H++ extreme scenario should be included in planning and adaptation strategies. So that's kind of why we're even talking about it just being included in the number of types of scenarios that are evaluated when you're doing a major project, such as a coastal power plant or a wastewater treatment plant or something like that. So that's kind of the perspective that is explained in the guidance.
Awesome, thank you very much. And I'm not seeing any more questions right now, but I just wanted to give a kudos for having case studies and examples of different frameworks throughout. It really helped me, who's relatively new to the field, to kind of learn a lot more about how this guidance is already helping to make California coast more resilient. Yeah, it was very awesome to read. So again, put questions in the Q&A panel chat on the bottom right. And if none come in with the next minute or so, then we can give everyone a little bit more time back to their day.
And I just wanted to say, Jen, just thank you to everybody for your time today. We really appreciate it. And we're really happy to engage and answer questions and help, explain what our thinking was. And we're really looking forward to getting comments on this document. Obviously, it's just a draft. And so just really encourage everyone to reach out and talk with us about it. So thank you.
And I'm going to put the website and the email to send additional comments and questions in the chat one last time. Again, it is open until this Friday. So if you have more questions, feel free. Oh, there's one more question. Just kidding. And thanks, Daniel, for this question. Given certain local jurisdictions are recently using the H++ scenario, and when considering amending their LCPs, what do you expect these jurisdictions to analyze the H++ after the publication of the guidelines? So certain LCPs are getting maybe rejected from the use of the H++. How would you recommend they proceed?
I mean, I think, as we all know, this is a process, and working together on sea level rise adaptation is an incredibly challenging process. We have a local government working group right now with our commission. We have a subcommittee of commissioners as well as representatives from CSAC and League of Cities, where this is a topic that's being discussed. And I think that, you know, all I can say is that, you know, commission staff are supportive of working with local governments to make progress forward. And that's what the local government working group is all about, is making forward progress, even if we're not necessarily addressing everything, absolutely everything all at once. And so I would say, you know, and as we all know, there's a lot of political challenges. And so it's just going to take a lot of working together. And I would say that the best thing we can do is have constructive conversations, understand the science that's out there, and try and move forward as best we can in each of our communities along the coast.
Fantastic. Thank you for that answer. And thank you all so much for joining us today. I just am really appreciative of all your hard work on this critical, pun intended, topic. And thank you so much for spending some time with the Coastal Resilience Network to present this guidance. And thank you to all the attendees that listened in. The recording will be available once I get it downloaded, and it will be sent via your email to anyone that registered. Thanks again, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.